In the early years of the 16th century, the Ming Dynasty of China was the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. Its cities were larger than any in Europe. The Forbidden City in Beijing was a monument to imperial power that dwarfed Versailles. The Ming emperors ruled over perhaps 1/4 of humanity, with a confidence born from thousands of years of cultural continuity. China was the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, and everyone else was a barbarian at the periphery. But beneath this facade of eternal stability, a silent poison was spreading through the veins of the empire. It came not from invasion or plague, but from money itself. This is the story of how silver, the lifeblood of global trade, became the instrument of China's destruction. It is the story of how the Ming Dynasty, one of the greatest empires in human history, was slowly suffocated by its own currency. It is a tale of unintended consequences, where opening the door to global commerce meant surrendering control of your own economy. To understand this tragedy, we must first understand the peculiar relationship between China and silver. In the early Ming period, China operated on a paper money system. The government issued notes called bao chao, and by imperial decree, these notes were supposed to hold value. But like all paper money backed only by government authority, the bao chao suffered from chronic inflation. The emperors printed too much. The people lost faith. By the 1430s, the paper currency had essentially collapsed. The markets reverted to barter, using rice, cloth, and copper coins. This created a massive problem for the Ming government. They had to collect taxes from millions of peasants across a vast empire, but they couldn't trust their own currency. So, in the middle of the 15th century, the Ming Dynasty made a fateful decision. They decreed that taxes would no longer be paid in rice or labor or paper money. They would be paid in silver. This policy became known as the Single Whip Reform, and it fundamentally transformed the Chinese economy. The problem was that China didn't have much silver. There were some mines in the southwest provinces, but they couldn't produce anywhere near enough to satisfy the demand. The imperial treasury needed millions of taels of silver every year just to function. China had an enormous appetite for silver, but almost no domestic supply. This meant that China had to import silver from the outside world, and that made the Ming economy dependent on something it could not control, the flow of foreign silver. At first, the silver came from Japan. The Japanese had discovered rich silver deposits in the 1520s, particularly in the mines of Iwami. Japanese merchants would sail across the East China Sea, bringing silver to trade for Chinese silk, porcelain, and tea. But then, something happened on the other side of the world that would change everything. The Spanish discovered Potosi. In 1545, the conquistadors found the richest silver mountain in history in the highlands of South America. The silver that poured out of Potosi and the mines of Mexico was so vast that it flooded the global economy. The Spanish noticed something remarkable. Silver was worth more in China than anywhere else on Earth. In Europe, the exchange rate between gold and silver was about 12-1. In China, it was 6-1. This meant that if you brought silver to China, you could buy twice as much gold, silk, or porcelain. It was the ultimate trade opportunity. The route was long and dangerous. The Spanish galleons would cross the Pacific Ocean from Acapulco in Mexico to Manila in the Philippines. This was known as the Manila Galleon Trade, one of the first truly global supply chains. The ships would arrive in Manila loaded with chests of silver coins. Chinese merchants would be waiting. The Spanish would exchange their silver for Chinese goods. Most of the silver stayed in Asia, flowing into the ports of southern China, particularly Fujian and Guangdong provinces. From there, it spread inland, feeding the insatiable demand of the Ming tax system. By the late 16th century, the flow of silver into China had become a flood. Historians estimate that between 1550 and 1650, half of the silver mined in the Americas ended up in China. The mines of Potosi, worked by enslaved indigenous laborers in the freezing Andes, were effectively funding the Chinese government. The global economy had become a conveyor belt moving silver from South America across the Pacific into the vaults of the Forbidden City. For a while, this seemed like a miracle. The influx of silver solved the Ming Dynasty's monetary crisis. The government could collect taxes efficiently. Commerce boomed. The cities of the Yangtze River Delta became the richest urban centers in the world. Merchants grew fat on trade. The scholar officials built elaborate gardens and wrote poetry about the Golden Age. The late 16th century is remembered as a time of prosperity and cultural flowering. But this prosperity was built on a foundation of sand. The Ming economy had become addicted to foreign silver, and addictions always end badly. The real catastrophe came in the 1630s. The problem started not in China, but in Europe and the Americas. The Spanish Empire had been defaulting on its debts repeatedly. The mines of Potosi were beginning to decline. The easy surface silver had been extracted. Production was falling. At the same time, the Spanish were embroiled in the 30 Years' War in Europe, a devastating conflict that consumed vast amounts of silver. They needed the silver for themselves. They couldn't spare it for trade with Asia. The Manila galleon trade began to slow down. Fewer ships arrived. Less silver flowed into China. The Japanese silver production also collapsed around the same time. The mines of Iwami were exhausted. By the 1640s, the flow of silver into China had dropped by as much as 75%. For the Ming Dynasty, this was an economic apocalypse. Remember, the entire tax system was based on silver. The peasants were required by law to pay their taxes in silver. But suddenly, there was a silver shortage. The price of silver skyrocketed. What had been plentiful and cheap became rare and expensive. Think about what this meant for an ordinary farmer. He grew rice. His wealth was in rice. But he had to convert his rice into silver to pay his taxes. In normal times, he could sell his rice at the local market, get silver coins, and pay the tax collector. But now the exchange rate had collapsed. The price of rice in terms of silver had plummeted because silver was so scarce. The farmer had to sell twice as much rice to get the same amount of silver. He was being squeezed by deflation. This is the nightmare scenario of a silver-based economy. When the supply of money contracts, the prices of goods collapse and debtors are destroyed. The farmers couldn't pay their taxes. The tax collectors arrived at the villages demanding silver, and the peasants had nothing to give. They sold their land, they sold their animals, they sold their children, and when they had nothing left to sell, they starved. The famine began in the northern provinces in the 1630s. A catastrophic drought struck at the same time. The Yellow River flooded, the crops failed, but unlike previous famines, the government had no silver to buy relief grain. The granaries were empty, the treasury was bankrupt, the social fabric began to tear. Bandit armies formed in the countryside. Desperate men, former soldiers and ruined farmers, banded together under warlords. The most famous of these was a man named Li Zicheng. He had been a postal worker, but when the government stopped paying salaries due to the silver shortage, he lost his job. He became a rebel. His army swelled with the dispossessed. They marched across northern China, looting cities, killing officials, and promising to overthrow the corrupt Ming Dynasty. The Ming government was paralyzed. They knew they needed to raise an army to fight the rebels, but they couldn't pay soldiers without silver. They tried to squeeze more taxes out of the population, but that only drove more people into rebellion. It was a death spiral. The economic crisis fed the political crisis, which fed the military crisis. In 1644, Li Zicheng's army marched on Beijing. The capital was undefended. The emperor, Chongzhen, climbed a hill behind the Forbidden City and hanged himself from a tree. The Ming Dynasty was over. The collapse created a power vacuum. In the northeast, a nomadic people called the Manchus swept into China, claiming they were restoring order. They defeated Li Zicheng and the remaining Ming loyalists, establishing the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China. The great irony is that the Qing dynasty inherited the same silver problem. They still needed to collect taxes in silver. They still depended on foreign silver imports. The collapse of the Ming dynasty due to the silver crisis teaches us a brutal lesson about economic sovereignty. The Ming emperors thought they were being clever by monetizing their economy with silver. They thought they were tapping into global trade. But what they actually did was surrender control of their monetary system to forces beyond their borders. They made their empire dependent on the decisions of Spanish kings, the productivity of Peruvian mines, and the whims of Japanese warlords. When the silver stopped flowing, the Ming government had no backup plan. They couldn't print money because nobody trusted paper. They couldn't switch to another metal because the entire system was locked into silver. They were trapped. The most powerful empire in the world was brought to its knees not by a foreign invasion, but by a shortage of metal. The peasants revolted not because they were oppressed by a tyrant, but because they couldn't pay their taxes. The dynasty fell not with a bang, but with the hollow sound of empty coffers. This is the danger of resource dependency. Whether it's silver in the 17th century, oil in the 20th century, or semiconductors in the 21st century, if your economy relies on something you don't produce and can't control, you are vulnerable. The supply can be cut off, the price can spike, and when that happens, the stability of your entire society is at risk. The silver trade wasn't just an economic transaction, it was the first phase of true globalization. When Spanish silver flowed into China, it connected the economies of Asia, Europe, and the Americas into a single system. A drought in Peru could cause a famine in China. A war in Europe could bankrupt a merchant in Manila. The world had become financially interdependent in ways that no one fully understood or controlled. The Ming officials didn't think of themselves as participants in a global economy. They thought of China as the center of civilization, self-sufficient and superior. They believed that foreigners came to trade because they needed Chinese goods, not because China needed foreign money. This was a catastrophic misreading of reality. By the time they realized that the silver supply was outside their control, it was too late. The addiction had taken hold. The withdrawal killed the patient. The fall of the Ming Dynasty is not just ancient history, it's a mirror. It shows us what happens when a great power assumes that the good times will last forever, that the resources will always flow, that the trade routes will always stay open. The Ming Dynasty was not destroyed by stupidity or corruption. It was destroyed by structural dependency. They built a system that required constant inflows of a resource they didn't control, and when that resource was cut off, the system collapsed. The emperor who hanged himself on that hill in 1644 was the 16th ruler of the Ming Dynasty. His ancestors had built the Forbidden City, restored the Great Wall, and sent the great treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean. But none of that mattered in the end. What mattered was that his treasury was empty. What mattered was that his soldiers were unpaid. What mattered was that he couldn't collect taxes because his people had no silver. He was the richest man in the world, ruling the richest country in the world, and he died broke and alone because his empire had become a slave to a metal it could not mine. The lesson is written in silver. Prosperity built on foreign dependency is not prosperity. It's a loan with interest rates you don't control, and when the bill comes due, empires fall. The Ming Dynasty thought it was trading with the world. It didn't realize it had mortgaged its soul. By the time the silver stopped flowing, it was too late to change course. The empire that had stood for 3 centuries crumbled in less than a decade, brought down not by barbarians at the gate, but by an empty treasury and a currency crisis. In the ruins of the Ming, we see the danger of building a civilization on someone else's foundation. We see what happens when the money stops. The silver that bankrupted Ming China is the same silver that enriched Spanish kings and Dutch merchants. It flowed through the arteries of global commerce, bringing wealth to some and ruin to others. In the end, silver was just metal. But the systems built around it, the dependencies, the addictions, the structural vulnerabilities, those were the real story, and those patterns repeat themselves across history, waiting for each generation to learn them again the hard way.